Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is another how to bass tutorial, and today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. This video is brought to you by Razer, who were nice enough to furnish me with this, the Razer Blade Pro, upon which I am doing literally everything. It's my main production computer now. I don't have a desktop computer anymore. I'm using this freaking literal desktop replacement. It's pretty dope. If you'd like to find out more about what Razer is and does and how cool they are, there's links in the description of this video that you can check out. In the meantime, let's talk about this bass. The title of this bass is Vicious FM Layer because what's happening is I tried doing a whole kind of like low mid high split thing, but then a bunch of stuff, and we're gonna find out when we get there. But you can kind of see what's happening. There's like individual two pair, well, there's three pairs of oscillators doing things to each other with the FM and all the other various processing. But let's work backwards and see what the later stuff we're doing before we get into like what the generation was. It's most of the complications in the generation. Those last two things that like are happening here is these two compressors and these two compressors, one compressor and an EQ. A bit of a rule of thumb that I used while doing this compression here, just because sometimes this isn't too solely obvious. When I was looking at the levels here, and it was sort of where I wanted it, this guy went up about here, and that's why I put that threshold there. I could have turned it up to be up 0 dB, but I liked the weight of it, the way that it was. I just wanted more of it in the modulation. And look at the modulation, you can see actually happening. And then also what the shape I'm doing is what it's doing and why I want it that way. So if this graph isn't totally clear, the levels of I just deleted it. The levels of this that we're seeing here from the sound corresponds with the white sort of shaded in area underneath the graph here, and then what the graph does here is corresponds to the result of the greenness we see here. If we remove the output thing, we'd see this purple input, and then what's layered with the output, which is green, we see this sort of beige thing in between. So the green bits are the stuff that we can see being expanded. Expansion and compression are sort of in the same kind of category. The idea that you're increasing dynamic range with expansion. We're not actually increasing dynamic range. We're still reducing dynamic range, so we're still compressing, but we're doing it by pulling up on it as opposed to crunching down on it and then turning it up, which is usually what you do with compressors. We're definitely not increasing dynamic range. As you can see, the more area gets filled in below the peaks, the louder things are. Louder is more of an average thing than it is a levels thing, because you can have something that levels way up super high or whatever, but then the thing with a lower peaking level can have more average level, which gets you louder in there. Same thing with the highs and the lows. I didn't do much on the lows. I kind of pumped up a little bit, but it really is light and slow because we don't want the compressor's actuation to be faster than the oscillation of a bass tone, which is pretty easy because it's this low frequency stuff, and that creates distortion, which puts extra harmonics just on top of the stuff that we're already trying to make. Not bad as a sound design tool, but when we're trying to mix stuff, it's something you kind of want to avoid. As far as where the bands actually are, I mostly just kind of did it by ear. There weren't really like identifiable separations in the sections that sometimes there are. You can kind of tell where like the areas are in your sound, but this one was pretty homogeneous all the way through, so wasn't much to be done about that. The lows is monoed all the way. This is a mid-side fader thing, so this is all side, or rather mid. This is all side. It's a lot more side. It's still mid in the side when you put it all the way up there. But when you go all the way this way, there's no side at all, so it's basically mono. And then mids and highs are spread a little bit, but lows are still because whatever. Although I didn't separate the sub when I was making this guy, I sort of expect that people do this with their stuff when they're making their own songs, and so it's not totally necessary for me to be doing this within each individual sound. But I'm using unison in the main thing, and the thing that is the sub that's in there, although it is separated within the preset, when you see what I'm talking about, the unison is clouding that low end a bit in a way that's usually not super great, but keeping it mono mitigates the damage, I bet. But yeah, let's listen to what this sounds like without the compression or this EQing, essentially straight out this delay here. How loud is that? Not bad. So comparison. This is what this EQ, this compressor, and then this EQ. The EQs were very light touched, you can see. A lot of I took a very I don't know what necessarily refer to this approach, but I tried to sort of elicit my spectral change in the generation phase, less in the EQ and post phase, except for this guy, but this is more sound design than anything else. Wow. Full screening him EQ. Yep. Okay. So then before the delay, there's distortion. So here's what it is like with the delay. Here's what well, without the delay. Subtle stuff. You hear that slight metallic tinge? Well, it's more or less what I'm trying to get out of this delay. I turned off tempo syncing, I turned it down pretty low, and then this gets us, you know, the sound that we have. If you just go to crank it, you can hear it. I've used the offset panning. This is just stereo thing here, and I have it all the way up there. I have a little bit of diffusion on. There's not a lot going on. It's a pretty basic delay function to be doing the things. Then, of course, distortion, along with this shape, which I assembled through experimentation. There wasn't a lot of like theory to be applied here. I'm also automating the pregain. Whee! And the mix is going up a little bit. So some of the non-distorted sound, which sounds like this, is being bled through the full distorted signal by the fact that we're mixing it in there, but also the pregain is being automated. So how loud it gets pushed through the business. So you see the white line in there. Some people are still lost a bit on what the wave shaper does exactly. And the white line helps us, especially with the pregain. Because the idea here is I made this shape and this stuff happens here. And technical terms, I know. But basically the idea is that this is a transfer curve. This curve with these shapes are going to force at the amplitude of the oscillation at the oscillation level instantaneously. There's no time variables involved in this. It just happens. And it will pull up at a level, like if this is silence, and this is like minus, I don't know what, 12 or 15. 16 or whatever. It's like if this is minus 12, it's gonna get pulled up to here, and if it's louder than that, it gets pulled down, that kind of thing. That's sort of what happens. But you see this white line indicating how loud the actual signal is going in there. If that white line doesn't actually like move past all this imagery here, like I could put some shenanigans up here and did nothing to change the sound, because the sound is not loud enough for this and to interact to that part of the transfer curve. It's only loud enough that it's interacting with this bit. Of course, if you've ever seen my regular distortion usage, you've seen basically the shape on the whole thing. So this is kind of basically doing this distortion, but for the lowest level of stuff. By lowest level, I mean like literally lowest of level, quiet, silent stuff. Of course, before distortion, we had this going on, and this is less EQ as it was. I was creating a sort of an interesting image to be distorted, because what EQ before distortion does some interesting things versus EQ after distortion. EQ after distortion works like you would just an EQ anything and just, you know, changes the sound profile or whatever. But what distortion does to things is that it adds higher harmonics based on amplitude of whatever frequency activity gets fed to it. So if I play a saw wave and, you know, you distort it, not a lot happens because there's already like a lot of harmonic activity and it's pretty much already all there. But if you boost like in the middle of the saw wave somewhere, suddenly you get a new series kind of accentuated going on up there because the distortion is adding that to that. And then you can do that with EQs and whatnot. And then the same works for putting holes and stuff. It will affect how the distortion applies itself to your signal. In a much more like deliberate and direct way than if you tried to EQ it in post. So that's the result that got us this particular EQ shape, which is not a lot of thought, but experimentation was put into it. So I just kind of did stuff until it worked, and I did that with the distortion on. Like the way the sounds before distortion into this EQ is not totally relevant because I wasn't working towards that sound. I made this sound first, put in the distortion, then EQ'd it with the distortion on. And I also changed a lot of the parameters inside this guy while the rest of this junk was on, which informed a lot about how it sounds now. Which is to say, I don't totally know how it sounds now. So let's listen. That's really bass heavy. Look at all the stuff active up here. Yeah. Okay, so first off, let's turn off unison. I'm using 8 voices of unison. But before we turn off the unison, I want to show you where the unison applies, because listening to just that output that we were hearing just then, you have no idea what the point of the unison is, because you can't hear its effect. So we have 8 voices, panning. So first of all, the panning is a pretty big thing. This is basically step 1 of creating any kind of interesting stereo image for any sound at all. And then the things that matter the most about unison are the pitch and the phase. The pitch being so low basically means that there's not going to be a lot of travel. You're not going to get, like, versus this amount. Like the supersaw version of it. You hear that motion versus being a little more static. Now, the phase determines the starting phase of each of the individual voices. And now, with a sound as complex as this, even without unison, jamming them together like that at different phases creates interesting phase cancellation, but it isn't total because it isn't perfect. But we get the result of it is this kind of smoother version of it, like you heard very plainly, like the apply that it has there. But the phase is a it's a delicate parameter because minor changes to it will create vast differences. Observe. And you also heard how at different points in the phase there, the sub kind of came in and out. The highest point there had a lot more sub than some of the lower versions that did. And the lower you went, the more the low end was more represented. This is what I was talking about having to separate the sub, because the sub is being cloned and phase canceled against itself. So you're going to lose definition there, or you're going to gain definition when it interferes constructively, like it happened at the top there. But that is the value of unison. But without unison, this is what the individual parts sound like. We have the first oscillator, which is a saw wave and a square wave and a saw wave, kind of crossfade between the two. You do, one of these. This shape is FMing the saw wave, and this gets us a kind of oscillator sync effect. It would if a lot of other stuff wasn't happening here. You'll see, like, we're doing this big macro thing, and like I have the macro up here and automating that, and then there's automating this X value inside here, and then this X value is modulating a lot of stuff, primarily volume, to get the modulation of what we want here. So like this is on this operator 1's volume going into the first filter, which is a high pass filter. Without the filter, this is what this calamity sounds like. And then here's the volume modulation on that. And there's also volume modulation on the second guy here, which has a different connotation, because when you FM stuff, if you change the volume of the modulating oscillator, so the oscillator that's causing the FM on the first guy, that will change the intensity of it. It's like moving one of the matrix knobs. Other FM plugins will just let you modulate the knob directly, but the theory of it is that if you change the volume of the modulating operator, it changes the intensity of the FM. So having done that here means that not only is it getting quieter like it is on this guy, it's also changing its modulation. Of course, when it gets that low, this guy's practically gone, so we can't really hear that change. This is a change that I made before I made that other change where it got to be so quiet. Am I ring modulating things? Yes, I am. So number 2 is also modulating number 6. So this particular shape is ring modulating, which is a volume operation. It's the same thing as FM, only it modulates volume. So ring modulation does. And then it's being applied to these 2 other oscillators we'll talk about when we get there. But that's pretty much this guy. The high pass is because like that low end mess that's going on down there is not needed. I'm also modulating the high pass position very lightly. I'm modulating the resonance amount very lightly. The wave shaper is off. I don't know why it's there, but it's off. It is off, right? Yeah. And then that's pretty much this guy. And then the intention, of course, is that the high pass layers with the other stuff that happens. Like the main dude, basically, these 2 guys, really basic FM. This is a sine wave being modulated by also a sine wave, but with the tension pulled down. So instead of it doing the square wave version of it, we have this sort of downward tension, which is just a different kind of saturation, which will still create a similar harmonic result, but a different modulated one if it were a modulator, which it is right now. It's also 1 octave higher than the fundamental, which is creating that kind of squarey version of the sound versus the darker, lower version of it, like that. Yeah, and then that's being low pass? Yes, so there's a low pass being involved. That's what it sounds like without the low pass. Yeah. I'm modulating the position of that cutoff pretty directly. I'm also modulating the volume on the number 3 here, which is basically also the sub of the whole thing, which is why it doesn't come off until way down here. I didn't want the sub to linger when the modulation was on the low levels. I wanted there to be a cut, so when you heard the cut, that there was a cut. The modulation is also being modulated. The mod input inside Citrus represents essentially the total input modulation into this one oscillator. So if I had more than one oscillator coming in here, I wouldn't have to modulate the volume of each individual oscillator to represent all of them modulating at once. I could just modulate this parameter because that's what that represents. I don't have more than one parameter in there, so I just did it because I could. And that's going out that way. It's not being modulated with the ring matrix. It's only being FM'd. Here's number 5 and number 6. Number 6 and number 5 is just a sine wave. Number 6 is one of these kind of modulators that creates a sort of talky tone that I used to do a lot back in like 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and right now. This guy's got a bandpass on him, and he's again being modulated very lightly. Like, these are they are separated, but they're moving against each other, so that like the separations aren't so static. Because what tends to happen when you do that with layers is that you get your EQ cuts, and then you can hear where those cuts are, because that's a tremendous phase change. It's being forced upon whatever sound is happening, and you gotta do a lot of work usually to mask that. But moving things is usually a pretty good way to do that. So all these sounds add together to create a kind of texture. I just realized I was doing all of this inside the processing chain. So you heard what all that sounded like with the processing chain, but that wasn't really the point, because none of that was how I made any of these sounds. So let's see, this is what this one sounds like by itself. Yeah, it sounds more like what I thought was going to happen. Jesus. Well, now you hear what all those individual bits sound like in the processing chain, but here's what they sound like without the processing. Yeah, that's more like the saw waves sync kind of effect. And then this dude. Yes, yeah, I was really wondering why it was being so distorted, and I really should have just checked, because it was being distorted. It's supposed to sound like nice and subby. Now, a big reason why this is like so freaking quiet is because of all the crap that we're gonna do to it. Like, again. Yeah. And a lot of the parameter changes that were made that the way that it sounds right there that we just heard it were not made by listening to that by itself. It was made by hearing it all in here, but it also was not made by hearing them individually. Like when we were listening to them just now, individually, we heard what they sounded like and whatnot, and we also heard them into the processing chain, and it sounded very different from how they sounded by themselves. And how they sounded by themselves was what I was trying to get at initially, but I had no idea how to get there. I don't know how to plan ahead for it. You know, sometimes I do, but not always do I know how to plan ahead for like what distortion and compression and all this stuff is going to do the dynamics of a lot of choices they make in a sound when you're making a sound design. Like, this is the sound design equivalent of mixing and mastering. Like, here's your mixing and here's your mastering, and then when you master stuff, you got to go back in your mix and you got to change things to make the fit whatever your vision was supposed to be. Like, the levels of these guys, like, we have the high frequency junk, the low frequency junk, and the mid range junk, and then how loud they are relative to each other when jammed into things like distortion and compression has a lot more impact on how the sound is going to behave spectrally than like even EQ would. So like, if you're curious about the different directions of the positions here, the middle position is 0, and then there's positive 100 and negative 100. So I'm not only just routing them together here, but I'm also kind of phasing them against each other. They're separated, so there's not a lot of interaction that should happen. But for things like this band pass here is kind of on top of both of them. It could help that like part of it maybe cancels against it. Of course, because they're not identical, it's not going to face cancel, but what it will do, like completely, but what it will do is it'll change some things spectrally that might have been difficult to do on a purpose with like a filter or something. Like, that's what Unison's pretty good at. Like, the phase cancellation that it causes basically creates new, like, formanty characteristics of it, you know? Yeah. And then everything after that is really just very basic stuff, just EQing into the distortion to do the carving of it. And like, I know that the shape doesn't make any sense because the bass is pretty much gone, but there is actually a lot of bass going on in there. You sort of heard, you saw how like without all the processing, this guy was very low end heavy and then very high end light. And this is pretty much why, because of the distortion. You might think, well, wouldn't it make more sense then to just balance it out so that the lows were more represented correctly against the highs and that kind of thing? And that would be the case if I were trying to actually like mix it, but because we're distorting it, I wanted those higher frequencies to be, rather when I made this EQ here, I wanted the higher frequencies to be more represented than the lower frequencies, which I guess, yes, would have been smarter to have attempted to do that individually from in here. But, you know, sometimes I'm lazy. Have I told you what quantum laziness is yet? A friend of mine came up with this. This is where, because I'm so lazy that I don't want to come back in here to make sure that I'm leveling everything properly, I've created more work for myself by doing this extremely destructive EQ curve. Of course, I'm distorting things, and I'm destroying things on purpose, so like it's not, obviously I can make it work, but quantum laziness is the kind of laziness that makes more work for you because you try to be lazy. And EQing is one of those things that does that, in general. Yeah. So this preset will be available to download in the description of this video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. And check out links in the description of this video for things from Razer and as well from Splice if you like Splice. And as usual, have a nice day.